Be a talk given by Professor Paul Lane, who's going to be talking about his career of African African archaeology collaborations. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of background about Paul Lane, because I think it's a very interesting background to see while he's here. Paul is the outgoing Jennifer Ward Oppenheimer Professor of the Deep History and Archaeology of Africa and Mandela Maudlin Memorial Fellow at the University of Cambridge. He's the principal investigator of the landscape, historical ecology and archaeology of ancient pastoralists and the Mapping Africa's Endangered Archaeological Sites and Monuments projects. He's an anthropologically and historically oriented archaeologist with over 40 years of research and teaching experience in African archaeology, focusing on only the last 6,000 years. Paul is an alum of the University of Cambridge, and I think you have more of a CV that's available through the brochure online. But it's well worth reading because Paul's done some amazing things. But we're going to hear some of them now in his presentation, and we should then hopefully have a little bit of time for questions and answers straight after this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I feel very honoured to be here, and I'd really like to thank Cambridge Africa and particularly the organisers of this event, and Karina especially, for the very kind invitation to be here. As was just mentioned, I am retiring from the position of the Jennifer Ward Oppenheimer Professor of the Deep History and Archaeology of Africa, and that's quite a mouthful of a job title, and I've not always lived up to it, but it is the only endowed chair in African archaeology in both the UK and in Europe. And what I want to try to do today is just to provide a little bit of a context for the work that has been done on Africa's archaeology and its deep history by scholars based here in Cambridge, and how, in a sense, we've ended up with an endowed chair and what that endowment has created. Now, I know for many of you, probably this focus on Africa's past may seem a little bit parochial, perhaps, given the enormous amount of work that you're all doing of looking forward to Africa's future. And archaeologists are often accused of, if you like, backward-looking curiosity. But what I want to sort of hope to convince you is that contemporary archaeology, particularly work that is being done on the African continent, and especially being driven by African archaeologists, is very much geared towards linking an understanding of Africa's very diverse pasts and the enormous accomplishments, wealth of knowledge, information about scientific experiments, architectural achievements, all of those kinds of things that tend not to get captured in the conventional history books, what they can contribute to thinking about more resilient and sustainable futures on the African continent. But I want to begin by, first of all, honouring some of the ancestors, and I just want to flag that two very, very prominent archaeologists who had quite transformative effects and impacts, not just on the direction of archaeological research on the African continent, but also the perception of Africa amongst archaeologists and others outside of the continent, were based here at Cambridge for periods of their careers. So Gertrude Catton Thompson, she was a fellow of Newnham, and she is very much instrumental in the 1930s through her work, her pioneering work at Great Zimbabwe, in challenging racial stereotypes about Africa. This idea that African societies were incapable of any sort of sophisticated architecture or technological achievements. There was this myth, if you like, amongst white settlers that Great Zimbabwe had been built by foreigners, and there are a litany of different foreigners that are selected from the Queen of Sheba onwards. But Catherine Thompson, through her work, demonstrated unequivocally through the archaeological work that Great Zimbabwe had been built by the ancestors of the Shona. And in many ways, Thurston Shaw's work at Igboukwu in Nigeria was equally influential in challenging Western stereotypes about Africa in the early 20th century. Very famously, Igboukwu has been the site of the recovery of some spectacular pieces of bronze working produced by the lost wax method of casting molten bronze well before the Benin bronzes were being produced. And again, this knowledge of this sophistication of a society and a complex kingdom in that part of Nigeria in the 9th century really challenged preconceptions about African societies at the time. And time doesn't allow me to honor and recognize a range of other prominent archaeologists of Africa who've been based at Cambridge, among them David Phillipson, who's been very influential both at a generic level in promoting African archaeology, who was instrumental in getting various scholarship schemes set up in the university to fund African students to come here and study for both MPhils and PhDs. John Alexander, another very eminent archaeologist of the Sudan. He was actually my first undergraduate supervisor. Pat Carter, who worked on Stone Age sites in Lesotho in particular. And then Rob Foley, who's still around, although he's emeritus now, and Marta La, who is still a member of the department. All of these contribute to and have contributed to the growth of archaeology at Cambridge. And I think that their contributions have also laid the foundations for many of the collaborations that I have, because they also brought in students from Africa through various funding schemes in the 1970s and 1980s and early 1990s, and we see some of them here. And even the latest graduate, Chioma Ngunadi, who is now head of Department of Archaeology at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. All of these individuals have risen to prominence within their fields on the continent. And it is through many of them I know personally. Some sadly have passed away, like Ibrahima Musa, who is the Director General of the Sudan National Commission for Monuments and Antiquities. It was through their connections, I think, that I've built up a network to be able to sustain and support various collaborations since coming back to Cambridge. And I returned in 2018 when I took up the chair. And I just want to emphasize also that I'm not working alone within the Department of Archaeology. We have 6 full-time UTOs employed in the university whose work or elements of their work involves and engages with Africa's various deep past. But it was, I think, the endowment of a chair in honor of Jennifer Ward Oppenheimer by Jonathan Oppenheimer that has allowed us, if you like, a step change in the research on Africa and to strengthen partnerships and collaborations with archaeologists and research institutions on the continent. And I really want to, I'm enormously grateful to have had that opportunity to be the first incumbent of the Jennifer Ward Oppenheimer Chair. One element has been the creation of a new annual lecture series in memory of Jennifer Ward, who had a particular interest in human origins and human evolution on the continent. And we've now had 4 such speakers, all African researchers who work on aspects of the deeper history of our species, and they bring to those discussions their own specific perspectives as African scholars, whether in the diaspora or working on the continent, and the challenges that they face in building both research capacity on the continent to research human origins. Much of that research centres, unfortunately, are situated outside of the continent, and also the challenges of communicating that human story and the fact that our species originated on the continent, the challenges that they still face in communicating that to the citizens of Africa as well. The chair has allowed also a growth in the teaching of archaeology and the research on archaeology in the department. It's encouraged a lot of researchers to think about Cambridge as being the host for their research projects. So we've had a real growth in the number of postdoctoral researchers coming and staying and being based here in Cambridge, working, contributing to the teaching as well. And I just tried to capture many of those who've been through the doors of Cambridge, if you like, whilst I've been incumbent of the chair. And additionally, we've been able to utilize the various sources of funding that are available within Cambridge. And I have to say that we're very fortunate that there are these multiple schemes that can be used to attract visiting research fellows. And again, this is, if you like, for those of you who want to build up those kind of collaborations in other fields, I do encourage you to look towards those other sources of funding to bring in visiting researchers from Africa for shorter periods, for intense work, but it also builds collaboration. And many of those that we see here on the left-hand side of the screen are now working in collaboration with some other colleagues in the university. And again, we've been able to attract researchers to bring large research grants, ERCs, AHRCs, NERC grants, etc., with a specific Africa focus to the department. And those programs also bring their own cohort of postdoctoral researchers as well, building up a very sort of dynamic community. We have about 17 active research projects being done by archaeologists and paleontologists on the African continent, hosted in the MacDonald Institute. And I just want to run through a few of those that I have been connected with. And I'll begin first with those that have been supported in part by awards from Cambridge Africa and the MasterCard Foundation. So an ongoing project that I have with colleagues in Mozambique is based at Xai-Xai and Xongweni in Gaza province, coastal Mozambique, north of Maputo, where you have an interesting situation. You have a series of shell middens, over 24 in a relatively small area, associated probably with the last hunter-gathering fishing populations in that part of Mozambique before the beginnings of farming, and then a continuity into the period as farming begins in this area. There are important records of the exploitation, the pattern of the exploitation of marine resources. We can use the data from those shell middens to think about wider questions about the management of marine resources, whether we see any evidence in the archaeological record from, say, 2,000 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, of fishing down the marine web, so whether there were any impact on the marine ecology as a consequence of these communities being there. But they are situated also within a series of coastal dunes with their own particular vegetation. And these coastal dunes have also been and continue to be an important source of ecosystem services for the local communities living there. And poverty levels in this area are very high. So the challenge that we're trying to address is, how do we protect and conserve the dunes, the vegetation on the dunes, but allow managed use of and continuation of the sustained exploitation of the natural resources available from the dunes and the marine environment there without without exaggerating sort of impacts and a loss of that habitat and a loss of the archaeology. And with support from the MasterCard Foundation and also from the Gerda Henkel Foundation, we've created a biocultural heritage reserve, gazetting something like 700 hectares, and also have funded the creation of a heritage centre that will also double as a craft market and hopefully a fish restaurant where local fishing communities can sell and market their wares so that they get real economic benefit from the tourism that we hope that this will help sustain and generate. Another project that I've been involved in and is again still on running, and here too I want to acknowledge support from, this is from the Cambridge MasterCard Foundation, has been work I've been doing with a Kenyan colleague, Frida Nkoroti Mbogori, currently a research scientist at the National Museums of Kenya, but also with a community of pastoralist heritage stewards who have come forward and volunteered to be part of the research process. They have been active from the very beginning in co-creating and designing the research project. It initially began as a project aimed to understand the history of and the origins of the construction of hand-dug wells in arid and semi-arid areas of northern Kenya and southern Ethiopia that are fundamental to the sort of pastoralist system. They provide an important source of water, particularly during periods of heightened drought, of which this region is very prone. But it is expanded into a wider concern within these communities with the broader heritage, both tangible archaeological sites, but also intangible knowledge associated with the production of containers, for example, and the cultural significance of maintaining hand-dug wells and the traditional water governance system in an area where there's increasing range of threats to this heritage. And we've been able to sort of develop school heritage clubs. We've held temporary exhibitions both in Nairobi and beyond. And we're now moving forward to work with the community to develop biocultural heritage protocols that they can use in their engagement with local government and national government to ensure that any kind of development that takes place takes due regard of the protection of their tangible and intangible heritage. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice. An earlier project that I had, again supported by Cambridge Africa, was with a colleague, Ibrahima Chow, at the University Sheikh Anta Diop in Dakar. And it built on an existing program of research that Ibrahima and his students have been leading, thank you, for some years. They have been documenting the many sites associated with the transatlantic slave trade in Senegal, but they wanted also to think about, rethink this and think about also issues to do with emancipation. And as the French took over what was then French Sudan, they created these so-called freedom villages, Village de Libération, and you find examples of these newly created villages spread across Senegal, Mali, and into Niger, that whole territory that the French controlled. And these are promoted in the sort of, or the colonial discourse as being, a way of civilizing Africa. The French arrived and basically freed all the enslaved individuals found within communities in West Africa. But our research highlights that actually, whilst these may have been technically individuals who were emancipated and given their freedom from enslavement, in those territories, the French created new systems of labor exploitation through indentured labor, and the freedom that was brought to those individuals was freedom in name only rather than in control over their labor. And many of these communities remain highly stigmatized in contemporary Senegalese society. So one of the aspects of the research that's been taken forward by a Senegalese PhD student who participated on this project is how do you use this knowledge of the creation of these villages in the 19th century and the heritage and the oral histories associated with them to reimagine, to create new narratives that are to destigmatize, if you like, the descendant communities that still occupy these villages today. Other work that's been done in collaboration with a wide range of colleagues, supported by a mix of funding from the UK and more recently from collaborations with German colleagues, has been working in the town of Pangani in northern Tanzania, coastal Tanzania, where you have an amazing survival of late 19th century and early 20th century architecture, much of it associated with German colonialism and also British colonialism. So raising quite an interesting theoretical issue in terms of, do we protect this heritage associated with colonialism? What are the mechanisms of doing that? What are the challenges of doing that? How do we embed within the schools program a wider understanding of the history of the town and how the built urban space that they encounter in their daily lives, what narratives can be drawn from that, but also how do you use that heritage, particularly working with the schools communities, how do you use that heritage in other disciplines, so teaching across the curriculum, using heritage as a leverage for talking about, you could use it in English lessons about grammar or about précis or about comprehension. You can use it in maths lectures, etc., etc. And then a final project that I came with when I moved back to Cambridge in 2018. I'd previously been at Uppsala University. Now, the Sweden, Denmark, Finland and Norway were uniquely collaborated together in the 1960s during the construction of the second Aswan Dam on the borders with Sudan and Egypt. And they created something known as the Scandinavian Joint Expedition to Nubia. There were many other similar projects, concessions given out to other research groups as well. But this was quite an interesting, and it's perhaps the only time all of those Scandinavian countries have collaborated on a joint archaeological project together. Queen Margrethe of Denmark was one of those. She also actually participated in an excavation run by Charles McBurney, who was dug in Libya as well, but he was also a lecturer or a professor here in Cambridge when I was an undergraduate at La Côte de Saint-Brieuc in Jersey, where she also dug with our current king. But leaving that aside, the project here has been, again, was aimed at focusing on reinvigorating research on these fantastic collections that were collected by the SJE in the 1960s. And I think we, in a day and a moment in which the issue of repatriation of African material culture held in Western museums is such a current and hot topic, and one I fully endorse, it is worth reflecting that there has been an advantage to a large part of these collections being held in European institutions, given the ongoing conflict in the Sudan today, and our knowledge that many of the museums, many of the archaeological sites, many of the museum stores in the Sudan that were exceptionally well maintained and exhibited have been obliterated as a consequence of this ongoing civil war. And we have to think about also about, dispersed collections can also have value. As Sudan moves into a reconstruction phase, how might we leverage an understanding of their deep history, utilizing the collections that are held in the West, and how might we build and strengthen the capacity of Sudanese archaeologists to research their heritage once peace arrives. Very, very briefly, how many more minutes have I got? Okay, excellent. Another real advantage of having an endowed chair is that what has happened, I think, since 2018 there's been a much sort of wider appreciation of the breadth and depth of the African past, at least amongst my colleagues who aren't Africanist archaeologists, perhaps also more broadly amongst public in and around Cambridge through a variety of activities that we've undertaken to widen public understanding of that past. And so just to sort of wrap up, just to mention briefly these projects that I will be continuing to run. So I retire at the end of September, almost 50 years to the day when I turned up as a rather long-haired schoolboy, well, ex-schoolboy, to start my undergraduate career here in Cambridge. So one of the projects that we're very fortunate to host is the Mapping Africa's Endangered Archaeological Sites and Monuments, generously supported by Arcadia. We had 3 years of funding, but beginning in a pandemic, that extended almost to 4 years. And we've been fortunate to get another 5 years of funding for this project. It's a multi-sited project, so we have research hubs or documentation hubs in Dakar, in Nairobi, and in Johannesburg. We work with, at the last count, I think 14 African national heritage agencies. It will probably expand to 18 by the time the project ends. What are we doing? A primary goal is to create digital records of all of the known archaeological sites and monuments that have been recorded in all of those countries that we're working with. These records mostly exist in paper format of one kind, photographs, maps, pro forma field survey reports, etc., but not in a digital format. This creates enormous challenges for heritage agencies if, for example, they're faced with plans for a new expansion of an urban area, new road network systems, a new port system, etc. They find it very hard to challenge, not to challenge, but to respond to the planning departments, to inform them about the importance of how important the archaeological sites are in those areas, what might be impacted, what knowledge might be lost as a consequence of that development. That contrasts with the systems that we have across the global north, where we have easily accessible digitized records of these sites and monuments registers. So the project is creating both bespoke digital records for the individual national heritage agencies, so they can use that for their planning control, they can use it for research, for setting research agendas, and also for communicating to the publics about the wealth of archaeology and heritage that is already documented for those countries. But also then to create a pan-national, a pan-Africa database. And this also has some real interesting challenges. So we're trying to work, because archaeological traditions cross the artificial national boundaries created as a consequence of the scramble for Africa. And because archaeological traditions in individual African countries tended to be, the roots of those tended to happen during the colonial period, there's often a mismatch in terms of the vocabularies and the interpretations of archaeological phenomena that are lie in proximity to each other, but on either sides of a national boundary, and one may be in a Francophone Africa, and one may be in a Lusophone Africa, or an Anglophone Africa, etc. So we've been working with our colleagues to develop a database that can accommodate all of these differences, and also to create a database picking up on some of the comments that were made right at the beginning. A database that is available not just in English and in French, but in Arabic, Swahili, Shona, Wolof, etc. My own ERC project, now underwritten by the UKRI, has a more modest focus, but it is trying to generate information about the historical ecology of pastoral systems in Eastern Africa from about 1,500 years ago up until the 20th century. This is a period in this part of East Africa that, as we know from the environmental records, have experienced at least 5 shifts in climatic conditions, sometimes improved, heightened rainfall, at other times extreme drought. And the project is trying to expand the knowledge about how pastoralists adapted to these changing environments to feed into discussions about what makes pastoral systems in this part of Africa resilient to climate change. Then a final project that we're involved in is an ERC project that does a rather kind of similar thing, but on a much larger scale, with a particular focus on African mountains and African socio-ecological systems as well. I appreciate I only have 1 minute left. So those last 3 are all projects that are going to continue, or I'm going to continue to be involved in after my retirement. And then just finally, what and who next? Well, my successor, Stephanie Wynne-Jones, has been appointed, and she'll be joining and starting in October. It's up to Stephanie to decide the direction she wants to take things in. I know from her work that it will continue to be collaborative. It will continue to engage with African researchers. She's a particular specialist in the archaeology and cultural history of the Swahili and the Swahili coast, but she has her own ERC project in Zambia. She's been actively involved in the Meersen project. She has also worked widely with researchers across Africa, and I can only wish her the best. Thank you all very, very much for listening, and to acknowledge the enormous thanks, both my colleagues in the department, Cyprian Brubank and Graham Barker before him, particularly in believing in the need for an endowed chair in African archaeology, all of the team at QDAR, and all of the development team at Magdalen as well. So thank you very much indeed.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to sit down in the middle. We can all thank Paul very much. I've got no idea how to turn this thing on. I think it is on. Let's try again. But it is now. It is now, I think. Thank you for thanking Paul for an absolutely wonderful talk, which is the start of the session this afternoon discussing African collaborations. And I think what we saw from Paul's talk was a very suite of narratives, of descriptions of wonderful and long-term collaborations, which have been absolutely fantastic to hear about. So we've got time for a few questions and answers now. And I can see one question at the back, which is good, and Caroline at the front then after that.
Thank you so much for... Okay, I think it's on.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much for that presentation. I just had a question around the digital records that you create. So in your collaboration with African researchers and institutions, when you create digital records of historical things, who stores them? And where are they hosted? And who owns the IP? Do these questions come up in these collaborations? And how do the African partners benefit from shared resources?
That's a really excellent question, and it was one I meant to sort of touch upon. If I can just briefly answer that one, then I'll take the other one. So yeah, do you want me to take a second one? Okay, thank you. So issues of data sovereignty, the storage of this data, and who has access to it have been fundamental to all of our conversations with our collaborating partners. And they are often faced with a challenge themselves. They don't have access to the servers where they can host that data. They don't have in-country or in-institutional data management plans. And they don't have the expertise either to do the sort of sustained digitization, or they don't have a member of staff who is dedicated to sustaining those databases. So at the moment, we do store the data on the University of Cambridge's server. But this is a short-term solution. All of that data there, as part of our collaborations, will remain on Cambridge's server as a security backup. But in the last 3 years of the project, what we're doing is working with individual national authorities to develop their their data management plans, to ensure that they have server space to store that data, and to implement protocols whereby access to that data, even where it is stored on the Cambridge University's server, is controlled by them. And we abide by, I hope, both the fair and care principles of making and managing digital data. But I'm happy to talk about that later at the coffee break. Thank you. Excellent question and really important. Caroline.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. You talked a lot about collaborations, and it was great to see the sort of deep community engagement in several of the examples. In a sort of discipline agnostic way, what do you think makes a good collaboration, and how can you be a good collaborator?
I would sum it up in one word, which is trust, or 2 words, mutual trust. I have been in research projects where we've had collaborations which have not worked so well, and I think it was because there weren't those pre-existing relations of trust. So a lot of the work that I have been able to do since I've come to Cambridge, I think, stems from the fact earlier steps in my career that included teaching and working at 2 different African universities, helping to implement their first programs in archaeology, running a research institute, a regional research in Nairobi, working with African scholars and researchers, but also from the experience of working with the community. So the work that I do with Frida and Bagori, for example, that began very much with us bringing together the pastoralist communities and sitting them down and sitting with them and having them work through the kinds of research questions that they'd like us to try to answer. So thank you.
I don't see any other hands in the audience, and if there are none, I'm going to take chair's prerogative and ask Paul a question myself, which is going a little bit selfishly back in time to your doctoral studies. So one of the most amazing weeks of my life was one of a group of 3, 2 of us students, one a recent graduate, walking along the Falaise in Mali and visiting and staying with the Dogon people there. It's just part of the world which I think is impossibly changed now. But can I ask how hard it has been for you to move on from people you've spent a lot of time with and the areas you spent a lot of time with, and whether you can give any insight into how you see archaeology can help, and you touched on it in your talk, restore memories after devastating conflict?
Yeah, thank you. I can get very emotional. But I'll try not to be. I think that in terms of what I have learned from interacting with communities around Africa is, I guess, the importance that heritage as they define it, not how I as an outsider might define it, is important to their sense of place, their sense of being, and in a sense their sense of well-being. And many ways you will have seen a title of one of the research that I do with Frida, with pastorists in northern Kenya and southern Ethiopia. The project was entitled Wellbeing, and it was just me playing around with the English language when I submitted the grant application. But it has become it's been brought home to me so fundamentally by our pastorist collaborators that the hand-dug wells, which can be in some areas 60 meters deep, certainly in southern Ethiopia, the Tula wells there that the Barana make, but even the Gabra and Rendili ones, maybe 20, 30 meters, all hand-dug, probably initiated maybe 600 years ago. And in the modern era, of course, governments and NGOs all want to introduce boreholes for providing safe water. And it is fair to say that the level of pollutants and microbial pollutants, particularly in the hand-dug wells, is quite high, so the water is not especially potable. It's used primarily for their livestock today. But the way in which boreholes are implemented has resulted in a fragmentation and a decline of traditional water governance systems that were exceptionally equitable. And now we're seeing privatization of water, restrictions of access to water, communities that once used to share water now becoming more hostile to one another. So those hand-dug wells, they're not just sort of architectural or engineering achievements, all dug without possibly even metal tools, providing an important form of water security during periods of heightened drought, but they are culturally significant. And for mobile societies, they are, if you like, a focal point in their landscapes. It is that collective engagement there, the networks that they link with, that create some sense of being, some sense of well-being, and some sense of a future that may be a better one. All of those things coalesce around the wells. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
Can we all thank Paul for a fascinating insight into his world? Thank you.